Hey everybody, today I'm going to be talking about a book called The Vortex Blaster. This is another Doc Smith book, and I bought this collection of books that is called the Lensman Super Pack on Amazon, and I went through all the Lensman books, and I did reviews of all of them. And then there was after the Children of the Lens ended, there was another thing, and I looked at it, and it was I looked at a couple of pages of it, and it was introducing different characters, and there was no Lensman involved or something like that, and it was called the Vortex Blaster, and it didn't sound like anything that was actually anything to do with the Lensman series, and so I kind of left it alone for a while, and the other day I went back and I said, oh, maybe I should take a look at that. What is that? Because I didn't know what it was. I thought maybe it was a collection of short stories or, um, a novella or some side stories that he wrote or something like that. What it turns out the Vortex Blaster is, at least in the edition that I read, is that it is, apparently Doc Smith wrote 3 shorter stories about this character named Neil Cloud. He's a physicist, he's a mathematical prodigy, and these 3 stories were connected together into the novel called Vortex Blaster, which was published in 1960. The basic premise of the book is that atomic power plants that are, all over the galaxy now, they rarely but very occasionally turn into these atomic vortices that are incredibly destructive. They emit lethal radiation. They turn a large area around the vortex into this perpetual molten kind of volcano-looking thing. It converts the atmosphere into poisonous crap that you don't want to breathe in, and, given enough time, it could convert the whole atmosphere. Terrifying possibility. The way that the book starts is that a vortex appears and destroys Neil Cloud's house, kills his family, and sends him into a fairly deep depression that only turns around when he thinks he figures out a way to close a vortex. This is, of course, in the first chapter, so this isn't spoilers. What this does is it, of course, creates a demand for Cloud's work around the galaxy, and he becomes the Vortex Blaster, kind of going here and going there, wherever these vortexes I guess it's technically vortices, right? Wherever these vortices show up, he goes there and does all the calculations that are required to try and close it. And it's a dangerous job, and, there's a whole bunch of Lensman-style technology and stuff like that. Apparently this story happens before Children of the Lens, kind of between Second Stage Lensman and Children of the Lens, because Kimball Kinnison is mentioned once but does not appear in the story, and there's a couple of other Lensmen that appear in the story as part of the actual plot, but we don't get to see any of that really, extreme fighting Boscone kind of stuff going on. Boscone has already been taken care of, but the Edorians are still a threat, but nobody knows about that yet. So anyway, of course, learning how to deal with these vortices makes Neil Cloud's work very, very popular, desired around the galaxy, and so he flies around. The first third to half of the book is actually kind of a solo adventure, which is something that Smith doesn't write a lot of, right? In the Skylark books, there's always a pair of people, and there's a lot of back and forth dialogue. And, even in the later part of this book, there's a lot more dialogue because a lot more characters get introduced. In the other Lensman books, there's Kimball Kinnison, and he's always talking to somebody, whether it's another Lensman or, his commanding officer or whatever. But in the first third to half of this book, we get a lot of solo adventure, which is actually kind of interesting because we get to kind of, I guess, sit back, relax, and enjoy how Doc Smith describes things, which is something that, when there's so much dialogue going back and forth, and we all know that his dialogue is very, parody 1940s style kind of stuff, very fast, very quick, lots of slang. When that stuff is all kind of shoved off to the side, we actually get a fairly calm and very descriptive and high vocabulary descriptions of things, which are actually quite nice. The first third of the book was actually very relaxing in that sense, where I was like, oh, he's not having someone, yammer at someone else and then they yammer back and then there's some kind of thing going on. He's just describing things as Neil Cloud sees them, and it's actually kind of calming and relaxing and, well written. So, it's one of those things where if you read a lot of Smith, you can kind of forget that he's really good at describing things when he wants to. He just doesn't want to a lot. After that, in the second and third thirds of the book, we get more dialogue, we get new characters, and we get some more typical Smith fare slang, philosophical ideas that are common in Smith books and stuff like that, more in the upcoming section. This is a book that takes place, it is a side story, which is why I kind of was like, I don't really care that much about this at first, but actually, the first third pulled me in and got me to read the other 2/3, and they're good too. But at the same time, they're a little bit harder to read in the sense that you're like, oh, what's QX? Oh, what's this? Oh no, they're talking back and forth again and making slang and yapping at each other, and I gotta actually pay attention. The first third is like, oh, this is nice and relaxing, and then by then you're in for the ride. So, like, overall, I'd say it was a very fun book. It does a lot of things that you expect in an E.E. Smith book, both positive and neutral or negative, and it actually has a really interesting twist at the end, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the spoiler section. I was surprised that this was something actually that I found worthwhile. So if you like Lensman books, if you like Doc Smith at all, you might want to go check this out. There is a Gutenberg version that I will link to in the description, and you can go check this book out for yourself and see if you come to a similar conclusion as I did. But I think what I want to do now is move into a spoiler section. So, if you want to keep things spoiler-free, there will be another chapter for you to look for. But we're going to do spoilers and then a little conclusion after that. So here we go. Spoiler time. Neil Cloud is a failed Lensman, but he works for Lensman. He's part of the Galactic Patrol, and when his family dies, he tries to retire, but they don't let him because he's just too smart. He's a mathematical prodigy, and they call him like a nucleonicist or something like that. And he's still a very Superman-y character, like we see a lot in Doc Smith books. The Superman character that can calculate whatever what nobody else can calculate, kind of thing. Only he is able to do these calculations that are required to close a vortex, which are quite difficult. And there's actually some good, technobabble around it, right? They're talking about curves and derivatives and stuff like that, and you're like, oh, you have to do this thing in multiple dimensions, and then integrate multiple times, and then you get this thing, and then you basically, look for the curve to reach a low slope, and then that you can, calculate something out to the next few seconds. Basically, the idea is that you need a very well-calibrated explosion, a duodec explosion at the center of a vortex to close it. And in order to do that, you need to be able to calculate where that vortex's energy will be in the time it takes the bomb to go from where you're at to where it is. And you can't be very close to the vortex because it's a very dangerous phenomenon, right? He gets irradiated in the first chunk of the book, and then they take more efforts later on to make sure that he doesn't get irradiated as much. Once he shows that it can be done, and he does it from like a little, they call it a flitter, right? One of the little one-man ships that can kind of fly over a thing multiple times, and he kind of flies back and forth over and over again until he happens to be flying over when the calculation works a way that he thinks it will work, and then he drops the bomb and closes the vortex. And you have to actually be careful, because if you don't do it right, you'll either expand the vortex or split it into multiple vortices that each have to be handled in turn. So, one of the things that this book is missing is ship details. Generally speaking, there's a lot of little, sometimes goofy, sometimes not very, self-consistent details, but there are details about the ships in Doc Smith books, and this one in particular kind of pushes that off to the side for talking more about how the vortices work. I'm never going to get that right. Once Cloud has shown that he is capable of closing vortices, he gets involved, against his will, in trying to catch a drug runner named, I have his name, but I wrote it, named Fairchild, who's actually making that theonite drug that we saw in the Lensman series. Right? That stuff would only grow on the planet, that weird planet that has the really short day-night cycle, that also has 40 feet of water drop down every day around the planet, and you have to grow the stuff very carefully. someone figured out how to make theonite, not in that environment, off planet, and so basically they're trying to figure out how to catch this guy. And of course, the bad guys are relatively intelligent too, and they're difficult to catch. One of the funny points is that when the Galactic Patrol is trying to get him to go somewhere to help them figure out where this Fairchild guy is, they say this, quote, "The Patrol would be very glad to have you as its guests throughout such a trip, all expense if you like." And then the response is just, they liked. So, he goes on this vacation to this world and helps to close the vortex there, but also to hopefully catch this guy, which of course somebody escapes, and it goes on for the chase for the rest of the book, basically. There are lensmen in the book, but they're not super lensmen like Kinnison. They're just regular first stage lensmen that are kind of working as, galaxy police, as they are supposed to do. One of the things that turns up as this process goes on, because these vortices are all over the galaxy, and so the question, and he's closing them, but the question is like, what happens if something happens to you, right? These vortices are unpredictable. They do explode randomly and get bigger and get smaller and then get bigger again. So the Galactic Patrol says, okay, we need to find some way to train someone to do the same mathematical prodigy work that you do. And so they end up basically providing a couple of people who are telepaths, right? And the idea is that through the use of telepathy, they will venture into Neil Cloud's mind, and then hopefully they will learn how to do the math that needs to be done to close the vortices. So, and all of this stuff is based on like really, really short periods of time and having to predict things and do calculations. And of course, the telepaths aren't particularly good at calculation until they have figured out, because they haven't yet figured out how the prodigy works. And so there's a point where Joan, who's one of the telepaths, is 0.3 of a second too slow, and so Cloud ends up having to close this vortex. He says, "Steady, Joan." Cloud was surprised at his companion's funk. "Only 0.3 of a second to get yet is all." "Only 0.3? What do you mean, only?" the woman snapped. "Don't you know that those 0.3 of a second are just about in the same class as the 0.003 of a degree just above zero absolute?" End quote. It's funny because this book was published in 1960, when I think it might be pre-laser, and it's definitely pre-laser cooling. But as a physicist, it's funny because getting down to about 4 Kelvin is pretty easy. 4 Kelvin is liquid helium, and if you do liquid helium of a particular type, you can get down to 3.6, I believe. And that's not so hard. But getting from 3.6 down lower, was very difficult back then, and it's difficult to do in condensed matter these days, right? Like you don't do it by putting something up against something that's colder than it anymore, because you just can't. Background radiation of the universe is three some Kelvin, so there's no way to block out stuff and let things radiate away their heat. What we do nowadays, if we want to get below 4 Kelvin, what we usually will do is we'll want to do it for like a gas of rubidium or some other sodium-like gas, right? And technically they're metals, but they're in such low pressure conditions that they're still gaseous at that stage. And what you'll do is you'll use a laser, and you'll put a laser just shy of a cycling transition, and you'll cycle them back and forth. And depending on the width of the cycling transition, that is its line width, you can get to lower and lower temperatures. It's very difficult to get below 4 Kelvin in condensed matter, but in non-condensed matter, it's actually pretty easy to get all the way down to nanokelvin or even lower. So it's kind of a routine thing that is done these days, and it's just kind of funny that he's like, those 3/3000ths of a degree above zero absolute. It's like, that's not the hard part, right? The hard part is finding something that can do laser cooling. But once laser cooling was invented, it became relatively routine, and it's not like it's not a linear problem, I guess, is the point I'm making, right? Like it's harder, 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 and now you need a different thing, and then it's relatively easy to get way lower than that. But it's like it's easy to get from room temperature to a nanokelvin if you're dealing with the right material. But that material and the technique didn't exist when he was writing, and so it's like the assumption is that it's like you need a bigger and bigger refrigerator to keep getting colder, which is what people tried at the time, right? They were like, oh, let's put a refrigerator inside a refrigerator inside a refrigerator. I think they called it a dilution refrigerator, right? But this is a real science thing that he was kind of talking about, but a little bit after he died, the techniques to go way below that became and fairly long after he died, but those techniques, totally different techniques had to be invented that moved things in a totally different way. So I just thought that was a fun quote. So this telepathy arc kind of marks the second half of the book. We get a bunch of new characters. In the first part, he was kind of flying around in a solo ship. He had his flitter in one cargo hold. He had a bunch of duodeck bombs in the other cargo hold, and he would fly from planet to planet. He would use the flitter and the bombs to close these vortices. But of course, he ends up rescuing some people at some point, and they're like, well, you need a pilot, and you need a mechanic, and you need this, and you need that, and you need this. And he's like, no, I don't really need any of that. He's like, if you had the smallest problem out in space, you would die. And the galaxy would lose, its best vortex blaster. You're going to have a crew. In fact, they end up giving him a small cruiser, and then he uses the cruiser and his small crew to go from planet to planet, and then uses the flitter to close the vortices. One of the problems with this part of the book, though, is that we introduce a bunch of characters all at once, and number one, their names are not particularly they're not named. Alan, Bob, and Corey. They're named some goofy combination of letters, and so it's very hard to kind of remember who's who. And then some of them don't even have any dialogue. They're just introduced as a character, and you're like, oh, okay, that's a character. And then they're not mentioned for another 40 pages, and you go back and you're like, wait, who was Merilulu? I don't remember that character, and you have to flip back and figure it out. At least I did. And so, that part is not particularly well handled. It's a little much for me, at least, in being introduced to characters, especially when some of them don't actually have any dialogue, and they just kind of appear and oh, you're the ship's cook now. It's like, okay, but then they're important later on. You're like, what? Who? What? Because they haven't mentioned in a while. Anyway, one of the cool things that Doc Smith introduces here is he creates a language called spaceall, which he says is, quote, the lingua franca of deep space, that anyone who works in deep space far from populated planets uses this language of spaceall. He also mentions that there's a language called galactic Spanish, which is going to overtake galactic English as the most common language in the galaxy. We get several different alien types, including, and this is I just thought this was really funny. But there's basically an anthropomorphic Catwoman that appears. Her name is Vesta. She's from the planet Vega, and it's just like because a lot of the aliens are described in ways that are just weird, right? Like we have a group of aliens called the Chiclodorians, right? That are just pink all over, and they have red hair, and their whole body is pink. Their teeth are pink, and they look at a human being and they're like, why aren't your teeth pink, right? We have a character named Luda, who I forget what species she was called, but here's how she's described. Quote, the lower part of her body was somewhat like that of a small elephant, one weighing perhaps 400 pounds. The skin, however, was clear and fine and delicately tanned. There were no ears or tusks. The neck was longer. The trunk was shorter, divided at the tip to form a highly capable hand, and between the somewhat protuberant eyes of this feeding head, there thrust out a boldly Roman, startlingly human nose. The brain in this head was very small, being concerned only with matters of food. So, end quote. So that's how one alien is described. You have the pink aliens, you have this weird elephant thing, you have this other thing where they have these bone neck things protecting their head. There's all kinds of really creative things, and then there's just Catwoman. You're like, oh, okay, fine. and Vesta, the Catwoman, is like a linguist, and so she's part of the team that's helping to kind of translate thoughts for one person to writing to thoughts for another person, kind of thing. There's this whole process going on that is not very well explained, but it's complicated, and that's what Doc Smith loves to do, is make things complicated. So as they're closing the net on this drug network, right? They're trying to find this, what's his name again? Fairchild guy. They start, of course, one of the things that Doc Smith loves to do is I don't know. They basically visit hot places, like places where the temperature is hot, and so naturally they have to wear less clothing. And so, like, we've seen this in Skylark, we've seen this in earlier Lensman books, but like a bunch of people are walking around basically naked, and it's not really dwelt upon in a heavy way, but it is mentioned. It's just very funny. They finally visit this one planet, and they basically go and do a run on a casino, which is like this whole 1 or 2 chapter section of the book, which is actually kind of fun and bizarre. But like basically they're using Lensman and telepathy and calculations in a casino, and they get some nice perspectives on there. They're basically kind of pushing the games in their favor. And like normally you think about like someone trying to cheat a casino and they just win every time, right? But here's the way that Smith describes it that I thought was really like just perfectly apt. Here we go. Quote, "Hence, Cloud did well enough. And when a house is paying 35 to 1 on odds that have been cut down to 8 or 10 to 1, it is very, very bad for the house," end quote. So, despite the fact that they have telepathy and all these abilities to calculate and Lensman on tap and all this stuff, they've only managed to take the 35 to 1 odds and reduce them to 8 to 1 or 10 to 1. But still, they note that, hey, you still will beat the house if they're paying 35 to 1 on your 10 to 1. So I just thought that was really a great little chunk of the story. And very fun, too, because what ends up happening is Neil Cloud, who is good but not amazing at chess, but he's very good at calculating, and Joan, who is a former chess grandmaster, and she says former. There's a point earlier in the book where they're like, former grandmaster, and she's like, well, yeah, I'm a telepath, so I don't do chess anymore in a competitive sense because it would not really be fair. Which I thought that was a great little bit. But, she can turn it off if she so desires to. And Neil Cloud he's so mathematically intelligent that he can make himself a thought screen kind of thing. So, it kind of works, but it's also a little bit contrived. But they basically have a chess match in a room by themselves. And while they're having this chess match, they're also like pushing the odds on the other stuff in the casino. And Vesta's just winning a ton of money. And nobody knows that she's related to them either. They talk about the chess match, and like the guy who runs the casino is like a very skilled chess hobbyist. He's like, oh, I'm not a grandmaster, but I think I'm a master, and I was doing pretty well. And there's a bunch of points back and forth where he's like, why did you do that? And she's like, oh, I'll tell you later. And at the very end, the chess game doesn't quite end. The casino decides to close because they're losing so much money. It's not just Vesta that's winning, it's everybody that's winning. And so, like, they have no idea what's going on. And so they're like, Casey, okay, house is closed, everybody out. And there's 2 people in this room by themselves playing chess in a very, like, concentrated way. And they have to, like, tip the board a little bit to like, get them out of their concentration. And it's just really, really funny. And then they're like, yeah, the casino's closed, you have to go. And they're like, oh, we didn't finish the game. And the guy is like, well, could you send me the tape when if you finish the game? And she's like, sure, I'll send you the tape if you finish the game, when we finish the game. And so she does. And then there's actually a little fourth wall break where Doc Smith himself signs the end of this chapter. And he says, quote, "It is perhaps superfluous to all that this game was never published. EES. E.E. Smith," right? And so, like, they sent him the tape, and it was just too complicated for him to even understand either. So it was just kind of a fun little moment. But here's the thing. Them doing this caper to this casino basically gets them to send information out to Fairchild. And so this helps them figure out that Fairchild is actually on Vesta's planet, the planet that circles around Vega, where all the cat people live. And so they have this another chapter or two where it's just this final search for a drug runner Fairchild on the cat person planet around the star Vega. And it's funny because he calls people from Vega Vegians, or maybe Vegians, Vegians, and I guess it's to distinguish from vegan. I never looked this up before, but apparently the word vegan, as we know it today, was first used in that sense in approximately 1944. So, factoid. And it made me think a little bit about the names too. Like nowadays in science fiction, people call Earth Terra. And so I wondered where Tellus came from. But Tellus is actually an older word in Latin, the same language that Terra's in, but Tellus is an older word in Latin for the Earth, actually, or like the Earth God. So, I don't know, I learned something there. Oh, I forgot. Okay, there's this weird moment where there's a chapter that's called, I think it's called Cloud Loses an Arm, right? And so you go through the whole chapter and you're like, where's Cloud going to lose the arm? And it turns out that for some reason, I'm not sure what happened. Either there was a mistake in the publishing, or something got separated somewhere else, or what. But anyway, it turns out that Cloud loses the arm, but he loses the arm the chapter after the chapter called Cloud Loses an Arm, which I thought was also very funny. After they figure out all of the stuff and they capture Fairchild, or actually they kill Fairchild, the bad guy does bite it in the end. And then there's this weird chunk of like I'd say like 6 pages, six-ish pages kind of thing, where like all of the people that are on the ship start thinking about romance and like how, they'd like to have children and stuff like that. And like it's this thing that goes for a couple of pages, and it basically culminates in the fact that like finally after all this time, Cloud kind of accepts that Joan, that he might actually be in love with Joan when he thought that he would never love anybody else again, kind of thing. It's a very weird romantic side plot that just kind of appears and then disappears, and it's like, okay, fine, whatever. But we know that Smith likes to put that kind of stuff in the book a little bit. But the thing is that when Cloud is doing the telepathy back and forth with Joan, something happens that causes him to become like one of the greatest telepaths in all the galaxy. The Chicladorians say that they have level 5 telepaths, of which they're like, single digit or small double digit number in the whole galaxy, and like he's a level 6. So we get more E.E. Smith Superman character thing going on there. But what this does is it pushes into the final plot twist, because earlier on, he was coming up with a pattern. He was like, he's a mathematician, and so he's like, this is weird. There is a pattern in where these vortices are showing up, and I can't quite get it, but based on what I've come to understand, it appears to be that someone is deliberately creating these vortices. And everybody's like, well, purposefully creating the vortices? That doesn't make any sense. I mean, like, it's not even true that these things could have all been done by some bad guy that's trying to do it. It's been bad for the bad guys too. And this sets us up for the final twist of the book, which is basically that Cloud discovers that the vortices are actually incubators for a type of life that is so advanced that all the life in the galaxy didn't even register as intelligent life to them. And so they saw these atomic plants being built, and they said, oh, these are places where we could build incubators for our children, basically. And so they're like, well, there's no intelligent life here. We're not going to hurt anyone if we use it, so let's use it. And so they start, essentially blowing these things up and killing a bunch of people without realizing that what they're doing is dealing a lot of damage to intelligent life. But fortunately, Cloud's telepathic powers let him come to an agreement with them, and basically the deal is, we will build atomic power plants where you say you want them, on uninhabited planets, wherever you want them on uninhabited planets. We'll build atomic plants, and then you can blow them up and turn them into incubators. And the other aliens are like, cool, now we won't do it to anywhere where we don't have authorization. And so Neil Cloud kicks himself out of a job, basically. All the bad vortices go away, and everybody's happy. Happy ending, tra-la-la-la-la. Anyway. So yeah, that's the spoiler section. So let's get to the conclusion. So, conclusion section. This book was a lot more fun than I expected. The first third was very relaxing, and it kind of drew me in, and then after that things got more frantic and frenetic, but there was still a lot of fun stuff happening in the plot that I really enjoyed, including some good jokes, and even a little bit of fourth wall breakage, as I mentioned in the earlier section. The second half, or the last two-thirds, has a lot more slang and a lot more dialogue, and is less focused, but is still good stuff. It's still good Doc Smith writing, so worth reading. I think that the different descriptions of different alien types is still really good in this book. It's fun. It's not just like, dude with forehead applique kind of stuff. There's actually some creativity in there. And then the final plot twist was, I think, interesting, and it also kind of gave things a bit of an elevated tone of like, oh, we're going to do this thing and it's going to have this result for everybody, and, hopefully we can work this whole thing out, without spoiling anything. But, it was an interesting twist that was unexpected and made the tone of the book kind of end on a high note. So, yeah. I was really surprised by the Vortex Blaster. I kind of expected something, because it was the last thing and it wasn't actually part of the series, and it was written way later. I kind of almost expected it to be a throwaway kind of book, but it actually wasn't. It was pretty well worth reading, I think. So I'll put links in the description. Go check it out if you are a Doc Smith fan. This is actually surprisingly worth reading, and you may have missed it. So that's what I've got for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening, and clear ether.